Good evening, everyone. I have to say first that we are grateful to be here this evening, not as dignitaries, not as members of agencies whose efforts sought to put terrorism in check, but just as ordinary people whose lives were shaken, whose lives were changed and altered for all time on that terrible day 15 years ago. We belong to a club, and it's a club that we'd rather not belong to. It's called the Families of 9/11. We're all here today to remember, but I have to put to you the question, what is it that we should be remembering? We each have our own memories of what we were doing that day, where were we in that moment? How did we react when we heard that news? And what did we lose as individuals and as a nation on that day? Before that day, we lived our lives as Americans, thinking God always smiled on us and always will. And perhaps we took that for granted. Suddenly on that day, our future as a nation and as a people became fraught with uncertainty. Someone had perpetrated an act so horrible and so inhumane that the very foundations of our freedom were threatened. They meant to cause destruction, and they did. They meant to cause death, and they did. But above all, they meant to demoralize us, and that they did not do. The basis of that experiment that we call America was called into question that day. Our concepts of freedom and democracy were suddenly shaken, and we as Americans had an appetite for revenge. But there had been immense destruction that day, and we could not stop it. The mere speed and intensity of the act left us numb. We had spent the prior years celebrating the fact that we thought we had won the Cold War. We felt that we secured the world for our progeny and our futures. Maybe it was hubris, or maybe it was distraction, but our gaze had shifted. Our eye was not on the ball. The ball wasn't even in play, and we didn't notice. That day, we endured the deaths of thousands of people, and these names stand out in relief on the memorial that surrounds us today. Christmas 2001. Our house did not have the megawatt display that it usually had. Cards weren't mailed, and though we did put up a small tree for our children, it was one with a patriotic theme. Finally, and inevitably, we had come to understand the difference between a commercially inspired decoration and a faith-inspired celebration. You see, on the morning of September 11, with 342 of his comrades, a firefighter by the name of Tommy Sabella rushed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center with one thing on his mind. And that one thing resonates, I'm sure, in the minds of all of the emergency service workers, firefighters, police that stand here today. And that was to save lives. The radio message went out saying, the South Tower has collapsed. Evacuate. And the message came back saying, there's still people in here. We're not leaving. They tell us those were his last words. Maybe they were just trying to be kind, but we choose to believe it. He and 8 others of FDNY Ladder Company 13, Engine 22, Battalion 10 perished that day. And in the recovery efforts that ensued, the remains of 8 were recovered. Tommy was not. We have nothing. He was my wife Loretta's kid brother, a beautiful young man with a young wife, young children, and a world full of promise to live for. He disappeared from the earth that day. And when I first started dating Loretta, Tommy was 11 or 12 years old, played ball with him in the street, helped him with his homework, took him on his first camping trip, took him to the shore. He became my kid brother too. The absence of physical evidence still haunts us, and it's agonizing, and has forced us to consider the place formerly called Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan as his final resting place. Our lives, and the lives of all of the families of 9/11, have been dramatically and irrevocably diminished. We stand here as ordinary people, but life is very different for us now. We look at everything through new eyes. We live within the context of a new normal. We no longer measure things by what we will get. We measure by what we will give and what we can become by it. Our oldest son, Jason, worked in the New York Stock Exchange. His commute to the city took him through the PATH station in the World Trade Center. He was delayed that morning on the 11th. He was actually just late for work. But perhaps God was smiling on us that morning. The PATH train detrained at Jersey City, and he saw a plane slam into one of the towers, probably the South Tower. He took the uptown path, still trying to make it to work, still not sure what was happening. And with so many others walking downtown, trying to get to their jobs, several blocks north of the towers, he saw one of them collapse and turned. And we all saw those horrific scenes on television with many people running from the cloud of smoke and debris that chased them up the street. He knew he had to get off the island, and he also knew that he had to call us and tell us that he was okay, but the phones were out. So it was quite an agonizing day for us. We weren't thinking about Tommy. We were thinking about our son. He ended up walking over the Williamsburg Bridge to his grandmother's house in Brooklyn and spent the night there. Didn't get home till late the next day. And we knew by then that he was okay, but we still had to see him. We still had to touch him. And then we had to tell him about his uncle. That was a pretty tough day. It took him several weeks before he could go back into the city, go back to his job. And when he got there, he knew that was not his place anymore. And so he enlisted in the United States Air Force and spent 10 years in service to his country in a time of war. So we are just ordinary people, but we have lived through extraordinary times. All of us have lived through extraordinary times that shaped our lives in ways that we could not have expected. I remember how John Lennon sang, "Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans." Each of our lives is a pattern that stretches before us and after us, behind us. What's before us, we plan for, and then life takes over. But what's behind us is a record of all we are, all we've been, all we've known. We can think of it as a mosaic, and as we look back, we may notice that some of the tiles are missing from our mosaic, and we know that they were missing. We grieved for them. And we may notice that others are startled to find they're suddenly missing. We didn't know about those, and we grieve anew. And some will elude us forever. But such is life, and such is nature's way. But when those tiles are torn from their places, they leave ragged holes, and that is not life. That is not nature's way. We stand here as ordinary people, but we represent the families of 9/11. Tommy was torn from us as many were torn from those that loved them, leaving ragged holes that will never close. Yet strangely, I have to say that we found that through all the horror, through the fear, and through the many, many tears, we have been blessed. We've learned lessons that we'd rather not have learned, but the understanding, the compassion, and the love that was lavished upon our family through these times filled us with a new awareness of the understanding that we were never alone. Through an act of hate, we learned that love has no limits. Through an act of ignorance, we learned that compassion abounds. And through an act of savagery, we learned that the world is full of kind and generous people. Still, we are not grateful for having learned those lessons, because the price was far too high. Thank you.